And once again, welcome to Graefenburg United Methodist Church. Welcome to all those who are watching us online. And this morning, I'm really excited. We're going to be starting into a brand new sermon series this morning, a 5-week sermon series called The Power of One. The Power of One. Because the reality is, God designed us for community. And God sent His message and His Son in the context of community. You and I were never meant to go through this life as lone rangers. We were never meant to live life on our own. But the truth is also that throughout history, God has called men and women to do extraordinary things. And those individuals have changed the world. So as we go through the next 5 weeks, let's ask ourselves the question, could God be calling you to do something extraordinary too? Over the next 5 weeks, we're going to be exploring the lives of 5 different people in the Old Testament who responded to God, and then everything changed. So when God calls you, not if, when God calls you, how will you respond? Will you be the one that stands up and answers the call? That's what this sermon series is all about. The power of one. So join me. I'm in Genesis chapter 22, starting at verse 1. And I'll be reading all the way to verse 10. This is the New International Version. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. And He said to him, "Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about." Early the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey, while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said. "But where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God Himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. Today we're looking at the life of Abraham. A wonderful place to start this journey together. Because God's great work of salvation and redemption, God's great plan of faith began with Abraham when God called him out of the land of Ur. When God called Abraham to be a wanderer and a traveling stranger for the rest of his life. But in exchange, God promised that Abraham would be the father of the faithful. And God made Abraham the very founder of the Hebrew people. Do you remember the promise that God said to Abraham? "I will make you the father of a multitude of nations. Your descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the sky, and you will be a blessing to others." That was God's promise to Abraham. But we need to remember, as we're looking at this text in Genesis 22, that at this time, as we're looking at Abraham, there's no such thing as the Hebrews or the Israelites yet. This is before all that happens. This is the very beginning of their story with Abraham. And it's easy as we look back into Old Testament people to hold these people up as these perfect examples, but Abraham himself was nowhere near perfect. I mean, the record that we have in Genesis is of Abraham, a man who lied, a man who tried to pass off his wife as his sister, and a man who tried to take God's promises into his own hands to fulfill it because he got impatient. I mean, we're not dealing with a perfect man here. We're dealing with regular God. The God called for amazing things. As you remember how the story goes, instead of waiting for God to provide a son, Abraham and his wife Sarah took the matter into their own hands with Hagar, and thus Ishmael was born. And just a little side note into history. One of the beautiful things that we see how Abraham has blessed, literally, I don't know that there's a nation on the face of the earth that hasn't heard the name of Abraham. Because what we find here is when Abraham and Sarah took matters into their own hands with Hagar, and Ishmael was born, we find the split of everything. Because through Isaac came Hebrews, the Jewish people, ultimately us. We are descendants of that line in the faith of Isaac and Abraham. But Ishmael, the descendants of Ishmael come all the way down into Islam. The Islamic faith looks to Ishmael as one of its founders, also to Abraham. So in this moment when we have Ishmael and Isaac, we're already seeing the future of what the world would look like. Islam coming through the descendants of Ishmael. Judaism and Christianity coming through the descendants of Isaac. So it's interesting to keep that in our minds as we're looking at this text. Do you remember the story? Abraham was 100 years old. His wife Sarah was 90 when Isaac was born. Can you imagine for 1 minute Abraham who's 100, Sarah who's 90, and now they have a new son? I'm sure they had a lot of energy. I hope. Isaac, the son of the promise, through whom God's covenant would be fulfilled. The promise of everything finally come to Abraham and Sarah. And throughout Abraham's life, we see the picture of one of God's greatest intercessors. In other words, Abraham was one of those guys that stood in the gap for others through prayer, through offering himself, pleading on behalf of others. I mean, there's multiple accounts in the book of Genesis where Abraham stepped in and prayed on behalf of cities and people who were doomed. But today we're looking at this passage, what I consider to be the very climax of Abraham's life. The very moment when the wheels could have fallen off. The whole thing could have been derailed. The greatest trial Abraham ever endured. And the greatest demonstration of faith this world had seen until God himself offered his son on Calvary. So let's walk a while with Abraham in the land of Moriah and take a look at this text. At the start, verse 1, chapter 22, verse 1, it says that sometime later God tested, or your version may say God tempted Abraham. And God tested or tempted Abraham the very same way that God tests us. Now the Bible tells us that God does not tempt us or anyone to do evil or to sin. That goes against his very nature. He will never tempt us to do evil. But God does tempt us or test us to do good. He tests us to see what's really in our hearts. That we can be assured of. That we see all the way through the narrative of Scripture. Now, when you think of the Old Testament, and you think of somebody who endured a whole lot of testing and a whole lot of trials. The first person that comes to mind is probably, what do you think? Job. Job, right? I mean, even people who have never been brought up in the church, who don't know anything about the Bible, probably know the phrase, he or she has the patience of Job. When we think of being tempted or being tested or being kicked around, we think of Job. But look at the difference between Job's tempting and Abraham's tempting. With Job, we see people coming to steal and kill his flocks, his possessions. We see a storm that blows up, that destroys his home, destroys his children. We see a sickness that comes upon him that ravages his body. All of Job's tempting and testing came from the outside upon him. But in Abraham, we find a very different kind of testing going on. It's a testing from within. He was called upon to be the agent of his own testing. Abraham himself was to raise the dagger and kill his own son. Abraham's testing came from within. A test of faith from within. God had been testing Abraham's faith from the very beginning when he called him to leave his homeland, to leave everything, and go to the promised land. The testing had already been going on up until this point. But now God would see if Abraham truly believed. Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering. In Abraham's time, to sacrifice your own child would not have been an uncommon thing, especially in pagan religions. So the fact that this request was being made would not necessarily have come as a shock just in itself. But the shocking part of God's request is that this was Isaac. This was the son of the promise. Isaac, this boy who was to be the very fulfillment of all God said to Abraham. And now God wanted Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, the son whom he loved, a symbol of all of God's promises. But can you imagine how Abraham must have felt at this request from God? God compared Abraham's descendants to the stars in the sky. Have you ever been outside on a clear night and just looked up at the stars? Away from the city lights, away from the hustle and bustle? There's too many to count. Can you imagine? To Abraham, it must have seemed like those very stars were crashing to earth. As God's words that were once words of blessing now turned to words that must have seemed like a curse. Can you imagine how Abraham must have felt? But all we're told is that Abraham got up the next morning and did God as God told him. Although I'm sure that must have been the longest night of Abraham's life. It must have been. But Abraham decided what he would do. He would be faithful to what God had requested of him. So he and Isaac and two of his servants set out for the land of Moriah. Well, I've always been a little bit curious to wonder what Sarah would have thought about all this if Abraham had told her. Can you imagine her response if she knew what was getting ready to happen? Can you imagine? But after 3 days of traveling, Abraham finally saw the place. He left behind his servants to tend for the animal and the supplies, and he and Isaac went on alone. Abraham carrying the fire and the knife, and Isaac carrying the wood. And together they trudged up the mountain. And the conversation that we're given in Scripture, this conversation between Abraham and Isaac that we're given,